Did you know an unexpected friendship can save a life? In this video, you'll see how Charlie the parrot and George the elderly man formed a bond that changed everything. Stay tuned for a heartwarming story of hope and transformation. Subscribe, hit the bell, and comment where you're watching from. Let's dive in. In a quiet suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Denver, Colorado, the world seemed to move at a slower pace. The homes, made of brick and lined with manicured lawns, exuded an air of comfort and tranquility. The neighborhood was perfect for families and retirees, where time seemed to linger, giving everyone a chance to know each other. But for George, a 72-year-old widower, the days had lost their warmth after the death of his beloved wife, Clara. The silence in his home was deafening, and each passing day felt like a reminder of what he had lost. George's hair, a mix of graying strands, had become thinner with age, and his once vibrant eyes now carried the weight of sorrow. His routine had become painfully predictable. He would wake up at dawn, make his coffee, and sit in the same chair by the window, watching the world outside as if it were someone else's. Every morning, he stared at the empty chair beside him, where Clara used to sit, wondering if he would ever feel whole again. The house, now echoing with emptiness, felt more like a cage than a home. One afternoon, while George was sitting at the window watching the neighborhood kids play outside, he noticed something unusual. Across the street, in the house belonging to Jack and Emily, his younger neighbors, he saw a small, gray figure perched on the windowsill. It was a bird, a parrot to be specific. Its sharp eyes and inquisitive nature caught George's attention. The parrot, a Congo African gray named Charlie, seemed to be studying the world with a curiosity George hadn't felt in years. Charlie was the type of bird that could talk, but not in the typical parrot fashion. His intelligence was almost human-like, and George could tell, even from across the street, that there was something different about him. At first, George thought it was just a passing interest, something to distract him from his loneliness. But as the days went by, he found himself looking for Charlie whenever he sat by the window. The bird seemed to be watching him just as intently, almost as if he knew George was struggling. "Hey, you," George muttered one day under his breath, his voice hoarse from lack of use. "What are you staring at?" The parrot blinked and tilted its head, as if in response. George chuckled softly. "You're a curious one, aren't you?" Days turned into weeks, and George's connection with the bird grew stronger, though neither of them ever truly crossed the boundary between neighbors. The simple act of Charlie sitting on his windowsill and looking back at George became a small but important part of his day. It was the only thing that made him feel noticed, even if it was by a bird. Meanwhile, Jack and Emily, the young couple living across the street, had no idea the bird was having such an effect on George. Jack, an avid animal lover, was constantly amazed by Charlie's intelligence, but Emily was more skeptical. She often joked about how Charlie seemed more interested in watching the world than interacting with them. But Jack insisted, "He's not just a pet. He's something special. You just have to watch him." One afternoon, as George sat at his usual spot by the window, he noticed Charlie doing something strange. The bird, who had been quiet for the past few days, suddenly squawked loudly and began flapping its wings in excitement. George couldn't help but be drawn to the movement. It was as if Charlie was trying to communicate something important. "What's going on with you?" George asked aloud, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. "What's got you all worked up?" And then, almost as if on cue, Charlie squawked again, louder this time, and George heard the bird say something that startled him. "Hello, George. Hello, George." George's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't realized that Charlie had been watching him so closely that the bird had learned his name. It was a simple greeting, but for George, it felt like the first real conversation he had had in years. "Well, I'll be damned," George whispered, smiling despite himself. "You're quite the talker, aren't you?" Charlie puffed his chest proudly, as if to say, "Of course I am." And just like that, a connection began to form between the old man and the bird. An unspoken bond that neither could fully understand but both recognized. George, who had spent so many years in solitude, felt something stir inside him. It wasn't much, but it was enough to bring him hope again. For the first time in a long while, George didn't feel completely alone. This first chapter introduces the characters and the setting, focusing on the development of an unlikely bond between George and Charlie, the parrot. It's grounded in reality, emphasizing the loneliness of George and the simple yet profound connection that begins to form between him and the bird. The dialogue is realistic, with George speaking to the bird as if it were a person, a common behavior for those dealing with loneliness. For weeks, George found solace in his quiet interactions with Charlie, even though they were one-sided. Every day, he would sit in the same chair by his window, watching the parrot's subtle movements, and he would speak to the bird as if it were a real companion. His words were often quiet, spoken only to break the silence in his home, but he began to notice something remarkable. Each time George spoke, Charlie seemed to react. His head would tilt, his eyes would narrow, and sometimes the bird would mimic the tone of George's voice. It was as if Charlie was slowly learning the rhythm of his speech. One morning, after his usual cup of coffee, George stood by the window, observing the bird on the other side of the street. He wondered if Charlie ever noticed how much George longed for a connection, how much he needed something, or someone, to break through the isolation that had consumed him. A thought struck him. Maybe I'm just a fool talking to a bird. But the idea didn't bother him. It felt comforting in a way, to have someone to talk to, even if it was a bird. "Well, Charlie, looks like another dull day," George muttered under his breath. "Nothing ever changes around here." To his surprise, Charlie squawked loudly and, in a tone that almost seemed to mimic George's voice, repeated, "Dull day. Dull day." George blinked in disbelief. It was as if Charlie had absorbed his words and was now reflecting them back at him. A smile crept onto George's face, a real smile, one that had been missing for a long time. "Well, that's new," George chuckled. "You're starting to sound like me." Charlie puffed up his chest, seemingly proud of his imitation. He repeated, "Dull day, dull day," and then added, "George," with a clear sense of emphasis, as if calling the man by name. George was taken aback. He stared at the bird for a long moment, feeling an inexplicable warmth growing in his chest. "It knows my name. How could it possibly know my name?" For a few moments, George stood frozen, staring at the bird, unsure of what to do next. The connection was odd, perhaps a bit surreal, but undeniable. Charlie had not only mimicked his words but had somehow captured the essence of his voice, an unexpected, simple bond that George didn't know he needed. All right, I see you're getting a bit too clever for me," George said with a soft laugh. "You're a funny one, aren't you, Charlie?" Charlie flapped his wings, as if responding to the compliment. Then, as if understanding the conversation was coming to a close, he turned his attention to the window, watching the passing cars and the occasional dog walking down the street. George shook his head in disbelief. He hadn't expected a parrot to have such a profound effect on him. After years of solitude, it felt strange, almost comforting, to share a moment with another living creature, no matter how small. But in that moment, George realized that maybe this simple connection, this strange friendship with a bird, could be the start of something meaningful. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the houses, George found himself once again drawn to the window, eager to see if Charlie would be there. Sure enough, the parrot was perched on the windowsill, staring intently at him. It was as if the bird had come to expect his presence, just as George had come to expect Charlie's. "Hello, Charlie," George said, his voice gentle, as if greeting an old friend. "It's a nice evening, isn't it?" To his surprise, Charlie repeated, "Nice evening, nice evening." George chuckled to himself. It was as if Charlie had developed a simple vocabulary, imitating the phrases George used most often. This small, unexpected interaction felt like a lifeline, pulling George out of the fog of isolation. "All right, you win," George said, his voice full of amusement. "You're a good listener, Charlie." The days that followed were filled with more of these quiet exchanges. George began to speak to Charlie more freely, telling the bird about his memories of Clara, his late wife. He spoke of their trips to the mountains, their walks in the park, and how much he missed the way Clara's laugh had filled the house. At times, George would stop, feeling a lump in his throat as he recalled the good times. but he didn't mind. He needed to let it out, even if it was to a bird. As he shared more of his life with Charlie, he felt a shift inside him, a small but important change. For the first time in a long while, George didn't feel so alone. He could talk to Charlie without worrying about being judged or burdening anyone. And while Charlie never offered a response beyond his imitations, the simple act of speaking to someone, even a bird, made George feel heard. That evening, as George stood at the window, Charlie said something that made George pause. "Help, George. Help, George." George froze, unsure whether he had heard correctly. "What did you say?" "Help, George. Help, George," Charlie repeated, this time more urgently. George's heart skipped a beat. Was the bird trying to tell him something? The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, and George, shaken by the intensity of Charlie's words, wondered what would come next in this strange, unspoken friendship. In this chapter, the evolving bond between George and Charlie deepens as they engage in more meaningful interactions, including Charlie's ability to mimic and recall George's words. Through dialogue and detailed descriptions, we see how George's loneliness is slowly eased by his unusual connection with the parrot. The small breakthrough with Charlie's mimicry of George's phrases signals the beginning of a profound and unexpected companionship. As the weeks passed, George found himself anticipating his daily moments with Charlie. What began as a simple curiosity had now blossomed into a comforting routine. Each day, George would wake up early, brew his coffee, and settle into his favorite armchair by the window. No longer was he greeted by the overwhelming silence of his empty house. Instead, Charlie's presence on the opposite windowsill had become the highlight of George's day. Charlie, for his part, had started to become more than just an observer. The bird's once solitary and silent demeanor had gradually transformed. It was as though Charlie was not only imitating George's words, but was also beginning to understand the weight of the man's solitude. Every day, Charlie seemed to become more attuned to George's emotional state, reacting in ways that made George feel truly seen, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. "Good morning, Charlie," George would say each morning, his voice soft but steady. Good morning," Charlie would echo back, almost too perfectly, mimicking the cadence of George's voice with an uncanny precision. There were days when George, lost in his own thoughts, would sit in silence, simply watching the bird as it looked around the neighborhood. But even in the quiet moments, Charlie's gaze never left George. It was as if the parrot understood that the silence was sometimes the most comforting form of companionship George could receive. One evening, as George was enjoying his usual routine, he noticed something different. Charlie had been unusually quiet all day, and as the sun began to set, casting an orange glow across the street, George couldn't help but feel a slight unease. The bird, who had been so vocal and engaging, was now perched motionless in the corner of the window. "Charlie? You okay, buddy?" George called out, his voice filled with concern. For a moment, there was no response. George's heart skipped a beat, and he stood up, approaching the window. He peered outside, trying to catch Charlie's eye. But the bird remained still, its feathers slightly ruffled, its eyes watching George with an almost mournful expression. "Come on, Charlie, you've got to snap out of it," George muttered under his breath, but his worry was growing. Charlie, usually so full of life, was acting completely out of character. It was then that George noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. Charlie's usual perch had been knocked over. The windowsill was littered with the remnants of a small, scattered pile of seeds that Charlie had knocked over earlier in the day. The sight felt jarring, almost like a sign. Something is wrong. He instinctively reached for his phone, dialing Jack's number. His hand shook slightly as he waited for Jack to pick up. "Hello?" Jack answered after the third ring, his voice calm. "Jack, it's George. I'm not sure what's going on, but Charlie's acting strange. He's not moving. He's just sitting there staring at me." And George's voice faltered as he tried to find the right words. "Something's wrong, Jack. Can you come over?" There was a brief pause on the other end, before Jack responded. "Of course, George. I'll be over in a minute." George hung up, feeling a sense of dread settle deep within his chest. For the first time since their unusual bond had begun, He wasn't sure what was happening. Was Charlie just being a bird? Or was there something more going on? Something that George couldn't understand? Just as he was about to reach out to Charlie again, Jack arrived at his door, knocking gently. George opened it quickly, his face pale. "Where's Charlie?" Jack asked, stepping inside. George led Jack to the window, where Charlie was still sitting motionless, his head tilted slightly to the side. Jack crouched down to get a closer look at the bird. "Hey, Charlie," Jack called softly, his voice gentle. "What's going on, buddy?" But there was no response. Charlie remained perfectly still, eyes wide open but unblinking. "Something's not right," Jack said after a few moments, standing up. "Let's get him checked out, George. We can't take any chances." George's heart pounded in his chest. "But he's been fine for weeks now. I don't understand. Why now?" Jack didn't have an answer, but his expression was serious. "He might be sick, George. It's best to have him checked by a vet." The next few hours passed in a blur. George and Jack rushed Charlie to the nearest animal clinic, where they were told to wait while the bird was examined. George sat in the waiting room, his fingers nervously tapping on the armrest as he anxiously watched the door. "What do you think's going on, Jack?" George asked, his voice tinged with worry. "He's been fine for so long." Jack sat beside him, offering a reassuring smile. "It could just be a stomach bug or something. We'll know soon enough." "Charlie's strong, he's a fighter." But George wasn't convinced. He couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. Charlie had been more than just a pet. The bird had become a friend, a companion who had brought light back into George's life. And now, with Charlie so still, George couldn't help but fear that the light might be fading. In this chapter, the bond between George and Charlie deepens, but with a twist. Charlie suddenly starts acting strangely, sparking concern in George and Jack. This chapter introduces tension and a sense of urgency, showing how important the parrot has become to George's life. The dialogue emphasizes the growing emotional connection between George and the bird, and the chapter ends with a cliffhanger that leaves the fate of their unusual friendship uncertain. The waiting room in the animal clinic felt unusually sterile to George, as if the air itself was thick with uncertainty. He sat nervously, his palms sweaty as he clutched the edge of the plastic chair. His eyes darted around the room, avoiding the comforting pictures of playful puppies and kittens hanging on the walls. The whir of fluorescent lights overhead only amplified the silence that seemed to settle over him. Jack, sitting beside him, appeared more relaxed, though there was an undercurrent of concern in his eyes. He was trying to remain positive for George, but even he couldn't ignore the unease in the air. After what felt like hours, the door to the back opened, and the veterinarian, Dr. Helen Matthews, emerged. Her expression was serious, and George's heart skipped a beat as she walked toward them. "Mr. Harris?" Dr. Matthews called softly, her voice calm but clipped. George stood up immediately, his throat dry. "Is he okay? Charlie, is he going to be all right?" Dr. Matthews gave a small, reassuring smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We've run some tests. It looks like Charlie has a serious issue with his respiratory system. He's having difficulty breathing, and it's affecting his overall health. We need to act fast." The words hit George like a punch to the stomach. His mind raced as he tried to process what she was saying. Respiratory issues? Charlie's always been fine. He's a healthy bird. Jack placed a hand on George's shoulder. "What can we do, Doc? Is there a treatment?" Dr. Matthews looked down at her clipboard, tapping it lightly. "We can try a round of medication to stabilize him, but honestly, I'm concerned about the long-term effects. The next few hours are critical. We'll need to monitor him closely. Can we stay with him?" George asked urgently, his voice shaking. "Please, I need to be there." Dr. Matthews hesitated, glancing at the clock. "I'll allow a brief visit, but we need to keep him under observation. He's in a delicate state right now." George nodded, the lump in his throat growing heavier. He followed Dr. Matthews down a long hallway to a small room at the back of the clinic. Through the glass window in the door, he saw Charlie lying on a soft, cushioned table, connected to a small oxygen mask. The parrot's eyes were half closed, his usual vibrant feathers now dull and limp. George's heart sank as he stepped inside the room, moving cautiously toward the table where Charlie lay. Charlie's breathing was shallow, and his body seemed almost weightless. For the first time, George noticed the vulnerability of the bird, who had been so full of life and energy. His heart ached at the sight of his feathered friend in distress. "Charlie," George whispered, leaning over the table, his voice barely above a murmur. "Can you hear me, buddy?" Charlie's eyes flickered, and for a moment, George thought the bird might speak. But instead, Charlie let out a weak, raspy breath, his body trembling ever so slightly. "Come on, Charlie," George pleaded softly, his hand resting gently on the table. "You've been so strong for me. Don't give up now." The words felt hollow, like a desperate plea to the bird who had, for so long, been his only source of companionship. George had grown so attached to Charlie, had relied on him for comfort and company, that the thought of losing him was unbearable. Jack, who had quietly followed George into the room, watched with concern as George spoke to the bird. He could see how much Charlie had come to mean to the older man. It wasn't just about the companionship. It was about the way Charlie had filled a void in George's life that no one else could. "Is there anything we can do?" Jack asked quietly, standing by the door, not wanting to intrude on the intimate moment. Dr. Matthews entered the room behind them, her face lined with worry. "We're doing everything we can. But if he doesn't respond to the medication within the next few hours, we'll have to make some tough decisions." George felt his chest tighten as the weight of her words settled over him. The idea of tough decisions sent a cold shiver down his spine. He couldn't bear the thought of losing Charlie, this bird who had become more than just a pet. In many ways, Charlie had saved him from the depths of his loneliness. The connection they had formed, however odd and unspoken, had filled a hole in George's heart that he had long thought would never heal. "Please, just give him a chance," George pleaded, his voice cracking. "He's my friend. He's all I've got left." Dr. Matthews nodded, her expression softening slightly. "We'll do our best, Mr. Harris. We'll keep you updated." George spent the next few hours pacing the clinic's waiting area, his mind racing with worries. Jack stayed with him, offering silent support, but there was nothing either of them could do but wait. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, the minutes dragging on like hours. Every time George looked at his phone, he saw no new updates, and the silence between him and Jack grew heavier. Around 2 in the morning, Dr. Matthews finally appeared in the waiting room. Her expression was guarded, and George's heart raced as he stood up to face her. "Mr. Harris," she began, her voice gentle but serious. "Charlie has stabilized. His breathing has improved, and we're cautiously optimistic. It'll still take time for him to fully recover, but he's made it through the worst of it." Relief washed over George like a wave, and for the first time in hours, he felt his body relax. "Thank God," he whispered, pressing his hand to his chest. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Dr. Matthews gave him a small, understanding smile. "He's a fighter, Mr. Harris, and it looks like he's not ready to give up just yet." George nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek as he thought of the bird lying in the back room, still recovering but alive. "Neither am I," he whispered to himself. In this chapter, the tension rises as Charlie's health takes a dramatic turn for the worse. George's worry and desperation to save his feathered friend are portrayed in an emotional, realistic way, with the clinic visit and Dr. Matthews' updates providing a sense of urgency. The emotional dialogue between George, Jack, and the vet shows the depth of George's attachment to Charlie, as well as the hope that keeps him going. The following day, George returned home, his heart still heavy with relief that Charlie was, at least for the moment, stable. Jack had offered to stay with him, but George insisted he could manage alone, needing some time to process everything. As he stepped into his quiet home, the absence of Charlie's usual chirping felt even more pronounced. The silence was almost oppressive now, reminding George of the fragility of life and of the deep bond he shared with the bird. The familiar scent of coffee filled the kitchen, but George didn't have the heart to brew a cup. He wandered into the living room, his feet dragging across the hardwood floor. The armchair by the window was still in the same place, but without Charlie perched on the windowsill, it felt empty. The space that had once been filled with the sound of Charlie's squawks and playful chatter now echoed with a deep, unsettling quiet. He sat down heavily in the chair and stared out the window at the empty street. Across the way, Jack's house looked normal, neat and tidy, the front yard well manicured. But everything felt off. The house across the street, once filled with life and companionship, now felt like a distant memory. Charlie had brought George comfort when nothing else could, and now that Charlie was sick, it was as though the world had dimmed again. "Come on, Charlie," George muttered softly to himself. "Where are you?" But there was no answer. The phone call he had received that morning had been brief. Charlie was stable, but not out of the woods. Dr. Matthews had said it could take days for the bird to fully recover, and even then, there was no guarantee that he would regain his usual spunk. The doctor had suggested that George avoid overwhelming Charlie with too much interaction for the time being, allowing him space to heal. And yet, all George wanted was to sit by his side, talk to him, hear him say his name again. With a sigh, George stood up, walking to the window and gazing across the street. It was then that he noticed Jack coming out of his house, carrying a small bag of groceries. The sight of Jack reminded George that he wasn't completely alone, but the solitude in his home still weighed heavily on him. Jack saw George standing at the window and gave a small wave, which George returned half-heartedly. The two had become close over the last few months, their shared concern for Charlie creating an unexpected friendship. Jack had always been kind, but today, George could sense the unspoken sadness between them. As Jack walked over, George felt an ache in his chest that wasn't just about Charlie. It was the aching feeling of being old, of feeling the heavy weight of time on his shoulders. For the past year, he had lived with Clara's absence, and he had tried to fill the gap with Charlie's companionship. Now, with the bird's health hanging in the balance, George felt more alone than ever. Jack knocked lightly on the door, and George let him in. "How's Charlie doing?" Jack asked, his face etched with concern. "Better, I think," George replied, forcing a small smile. "He's still not out of the woods, but he's hanging in there." "That's good to hear," Jack said, sitting down at the kitchen table and placing the grocery bag on the counter. He glanced at George, a quiet understanding passing between them. "I know how much he means to you, George." George nodded, unable to form words for a moment. He wasn't used to talking about his feelings, especially with someone he'd only recently come to trust. But Jack had become a constant in his life, someone who was there when George needed him most, when the weight of loneliness threatened to consume him. "Yeah, he's more than just a bird to me," George said softly, his voice trembling slightly. "He's the only one I've had to talk to since Clara passed, the only one who listens. And now, I don't know what to do." Jack sat back, his face softening. "I get it, George. It's hard, but Charlie's strong. You've both been through a lot together, and he's lucky to have you." George's eyes welled up with tears. He quickly wiped them away, embarrassed by the show of emotion. But Jack didn't say anything, just gave him a reassuring nod. George was grateful for the silence, for the fact that Jack didn't push him to talk more than he was comfortable with. "Do you want me to go with you to the clinic tomorrow?" Jack asked. "I can come by, help you out. You don't have to go through this alone." George looked at him, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thanks, Jack. I appreciate it, but I think I'll be okay. I just want Charlie to be all right." Jack smiled. "I'll be here if you need anything." The conversation turned to lighter topics, small talk about the weather, the upcoming weekend, nothing too heavy. But even in the mundane exchanges, George felt the weight of his worry lifting, just a little. It wasn't a cure for the isolation he felt, but it was something. Later that evening, after Jack had left, George sat down on the couch and picked up a book that Clara had left behind. It was one of her favorites, a novel she had read several times. He ran his fingers over the worn cover, tracing the familiar title. For a moment, he closed his eyes and imagined Clara sitting next to him, reading along as they used to do together. But when he opened his eyes, the empty room around him reminded him of the present, of the silence that had come to fill the space she had once occupied. He sighed deeply and placed the book back on the coffee table. He stood up, walking to the window once more, gazing across the street at Jack's house, and then back at the empty window where Charlie should have been. "Come on," "Charlie," George whispered into the night, his voice barely audible. "Please come back." In this chapter, George's emotional struggles are laid bare as he grapples with his feelings of isolation and the looming uncertainty about Charlie's health. His bond with the parrot is explored further, emphasizing the comfort Charlie has brought into George's life and the deepening friendship between George and Jack. The chapter illustrates George's vulnerability, his struggle to manage his emotions, and the quiet support he receives from Jack. Days stretched into weeks, and Charlie's recovery progressed at a slow but steady pace. George spent most of his time in the quiet, sterile waiting room of the animal clinic, as Dr. Matthews had advised him to give the bird space to heal without overwhelming him. Yet, every visit to the clinic felt more agonizing than the last, as George could only watch from behind the glass window, unable to speak to Charlie in the way he was used to. The bird, though breathing steadily, remained quieter than usual, only offering occasional squawks or soft chirps when the staff attended to him. George had made a habit of visiting Charlie every afternoon, taking small comforts in sitting beside the glass, speaking softly through the barrier, just so Charlie would know he was there. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best he could do. On the fourth day of this routine, George arrived to find a surprise waiting for him. Dr. Matthews met him at the door with a small smile. "I think Charlie's ready for a visit," she said. "We've started to see some improvements. He's responding well to the treatments." George's heart skipped a beat at the news. He stood straighter, a surge of hope rushing through him. "Really? I can see him now?" "Yes, but remember, he's still fragile. It's important not to overdo it. He needs to rest." George nodded eagerly and followed Dr. Matthews to the back room. As they entered, Charlie was perched quietly on his perch, his eyes wide and alert. The sight of him, even though weaker than before, filled George with overwhelming relief. It was the first time he had truly seen the bird since the emergency, and the warmth in his chest was almost too much to bear. "Hey there, buddy," George whispered softly as he approached the cage. His voice cracked, and for a brief moment, he couldn't say anything more. He felt a rush of emotion, thankfulness, relief, and something deeper. It was like his entire world had been put on hold, and now, it was beginning to shift again. Charlie's eyes met George's, and for a moment, there was nothing but a shared understanding. Slowly, Charlie fluttered his wings and made a weak attempt to hop from one perch to another. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a wave of hope through George. The bird was still here. He was fighting. "Good to see you back on your feet," George said softly, smiling through the tears that had formed in his eyes. He wiped them quickly, embarrassed, but then noticed that Charlie was staring intently at him. "George," the bird said clearly, its voice weak but unmistakable. "George." The sound of Charlie's voice, his name, spoken so deliberately, was like a lifeline to George. He exhaled a breath he didn't realize he was holding, leaning forward to press his hand against the cage. "I'm here, buddy. I'm right here." Charlie blinked, then tilted his head to one side. For a moment, George swore the bird seemed to smile, if such a thing were even possible for a parrot. And in that small, quiet moment, George felt his loneliness, the weight of the past months, lift just a little bit. Charlie had returned to him, in spirit if not in full strength. And George realized that no matter what came next, their connection was unbreakable. "Do you think he's going to be okay?" George asked Dr. Matthews, who had quietly observed the reunion. The question was more for himself than for her, though he needed reassurance. He needed to believe it would all work out. "Charlie's a fighter, George," she said, her voice gentle. "He's come a long way, but it's going to take time for him to fully recover. Keep doing what you've been doing, talking to him, letting him know you're here. Animals like Charlie are incredibly intuitive. The bond you two share is a powerful thing." George nodded, his heart full. He knew Dr. Matthews was right, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was Charlie's strength that had pulled them both through. The parrot had saved him, and now, George was determined to do the same for him. As the days passed, Charlie's condition slowly improved. The medication had begun to take effect, and Charlie started to regain some of his old energy. He chirped more frequently, even started squawking loudly at times when the door opened, as if calling for George's attention. The bird's personality began to return bit by bit, and with each new sign of progress, George's spirits lifted. During one of his visits, Jack came with him to the clinic. It had become a ritual for them both. George needed the support, and Jack had come to care for Charlie as much as George did. Jack had brought a small, brightly colored toy for Charlie, something he thought might cheer the bird up. The moment he held it up, Charlie's eyes widened in recognition. "Look at that," Jack said, laughing. "I think he likes it." George watched as Charlie reached out and grabbed the toy with his beak, holding it up triumphantly. Hey, you can't take everything, Charlie," George said with a grin. "That's for your new collection, not for eating." Charlie squawked in response, but it was a playful sound, one full of life, of the familiar energy that George had missed so much. New collection, Charlie repeated. George's heart swelled with a deep sense of gratitude. It was clear now more than ever, Charlie was back. The bird had not only survived but was now thriving again. And with each passing day, George felt the isolation that had once gripped him begin to loosen its hold. As they left the clinic that evening, George stopped for a moment outside, looking up at the setting sun. He felt a weight lifted from his shoulders, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that maybe things would be okay after all. He wasn't alone anymore. In this chapter, Charlie's recovery marks a turning point in the story. George's emotional attachment to the bird and the profound bond they share are highlighted, with moments of humor and tenderness between George, Charlie, and Jack. The slow recovery of Charlie is presented realistically, with Dr. Matthews providing the necessary medical context, while the growth of George's connection with both Charlie and Jack provides hope for the future. As the days grew warmer and spring began to reclaim the world outside with its promise of new beginnings, George's life began to shift in subtle, yet profound ways. Charlie, who had once been a fragile shell of his former self, was now back to his spirited self. He chirped in the mornings as he greeted the sun, squawked for attention, and had even started to play with the small toys Jack had brought him. The bird's antics filled the house with a sense of vitality that had been missing for far too long. Every time George sat by the window, Charlie was there beside him, perched proudly on the sill, as if to say, "We made it, together." And George couldn't help but smile every time the bird mimicked his words, or even added his own little twists to the phrases George had used most often. "Good morning, George," Charlie would call out brightly, his voice echoing throughout the quiet room. "Good morning, buddy," George would respond, his voice filled with warmth. The bond between them had blossomed into something George hadn't thought possible, a deep, genuine connection that transcended the boundaries of species. And though George had never been one to speak much about his feelings, he knew that Charlie had filled a hole in his life that he never realized was there. The parrot wasn't just a pet. He was a companion, a friend, and in many ways, a lifeline that had pulled George from the depths of his loneliness. One afternoon, as George was sitting with Charlie by the window, there was a knock on the door. He didn't expect visitors, but when he opened the door, he was surprised to find several members of the local community standing on his porch. "Mr. Harris, we heard about what happened with Charlie," one of his neighbors, Mrs. Thompson, said with a warm smile. "We just wanted to stop by and let you know that we've all been thinking about you." George felt a lump in his throat as he looked at the group of people standing before him. His neighbors, people who had known him for years but never really reached out. After Clara's passing, he had become a shadow in the neighborhood, a man who kept to himself and kept his grief hidden from view. But now, it seemed that his story, and the story of Charlie's miraculous recovery, had touched more lives than he could have ever imagined. "Thank you," George said, his voice thick with emotion. "It means a lot, more than you know." Mrs. Thompson smiled kindly. "We've all seen how much Charlie has helped you, Mr. Harris, and we wanted to do something special. We thought we could throw a little party for you too. A welcome home for Charlie, and a chance to celebrate his recovery." George blinked in surprise, not sure how to respond. He hadn't expected such an outpouring of support, especially from people he hadn't really interacted with much before. But there was something about their gesture, something simple and genuine, that warmed his heart. "You don't have to do that," George said, his voice hesitant. "Charlie and I are just glad to have made it through." "Of course we don't have to do it," Mrs. Thompson replied with a gentle chuckle. "But we want to. You've been through so much, and Charlie's been such a comfort to you. It's the least we can do to show our appreciation." Over the next few days, word spread throughout the neighborhood about the impromptu celebration. The day of the gathering arrived, and George found himself standing in his yard, surrounded by smiling faces and a spread of food that he never could have imagined. His neighbors had all chipped in: baked goods, fruit salads, even a small banner with a picture of Charlie on it. The sight of all the familiar faces, all coming together to celebrate Charlie's recovery, was enough to bring tears to George's eyes. Jack, who had been by George's side through every step of Charlie's recovery, stood nearby, chatting with a few of the neighbors. His presence was a constant source of support for George, and as he looked over at Jack, George realized just how much this unexpected friendship had meant to him. "Charlie, look at all this," George said, his voice filled with wonder. "You're a local hero, you know that?" Charlie, perched comfortably on his favorite branch, cocked his head to the side and squawked loudly, as if in agreement. "Local hero, he repeated, his voice echoing with pride. The guests laughed, charmed by the bird's antics. George, smiling more freely than he had in months, felt a sense of belonging he had almost forgotten was possible. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly connected to his community, to his neighbors, and to Charlie, who had become not only a source of comfort but a symbol of resilience in George's life. Later in the evening, as the sun began to set and the party wound down, George found himself standing on the porch, alone with Charlie. The quiet hum of evening surrounded them, and for a moment, everything felt just right. "Thank you, Charlie," George whispered, his voice full of emotion, "for everything. I don't know where I'd be without you." Charlie tilted his head, studying George with those wise, intelligent eyes. Then, in a soft, almost reverent tone, the bird spoke the words George had been waiting to hear. "Thank you, George. Thank you, George." A lump formed in George's throat as he crouched down to the bird's level, his heart full. He had never thought a bird could offer so much comfort, so much love. And yet, here he was, standing with Charlie by his side, feeling more whole than he had in years. "Let's go inside, buddy," George said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's been a long day." Together, they went inside, and George closed the door behind them, leaving the world outside where it belonged. For the first time in a long while, George felt like he had everything he needed: his health, his community, and, most of all, the unwavering presence of his dear friend, Charlie. In this chapter, George's relationship with Charlie reaches a new depth, marked by a celebration of the bird's recovery and the unexpected outpouring of support from the community. The chapter emphasizes George's growth as he opens up to those around him, rediscovering the joy of connection and the importance of the bonds we form, both human and animal. The party symbolizes the beginning of a new chapter in George's life, one that is full of possibilities and a renewed sense of belonging. As weeks passed, George found that life had shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. His home, once a place of solitude and grief, had transformed into a space filled with warmth, laughter, and the occasional squawk of a playful parrot. Charlie's health continued to improve, and with each passing day, George's connection to the bird grew deeper. What had started as a simple companionship, born out of necessity, had blossomed into something powerful, a bond that was now irreplaceable. Charlie was back to his old self in many ways. He chirped at dawn, announcing the start of the day with a loud and enthusiastic "Good morning, George." He would sit on the windowsill, watching the world outside, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. Every now and then, he would repeat George's words, adding his own little twist, creating an atmosphere of life that George hadn't realized he'd been missing. "Hello, George." Charlie would call from the window, and George would reply, "Hello, buddy. How's the world today?" At first, the questions felt almost routine, small, trivial exchanges that seemed insignificant. But as the days wore on, George realized that these moments with Charlie were not just routine. They were the small threads that held his world together. The bird had become a constant in his life, a reminder that despite the hardships, there was still joy to be found. Each morning, George would wake early, brew his coffee, and sit in his favorite chair by the window. The warmth of the sunlight streaming through the glass felt comforting, but it was Charlie's presence that made the space feel alive. Charlie would greet him as soon as he sat down, his bright eyes following George's every move. "Morning, George." Charlie would squawk happily, flapping his wings excitedly. "Morning, Charlie," George would respond, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "How's the day looking?" Charlie would chirp in response, tilting his head as if considering the question. Then, without fail, he would say something unexpected, something that always brought a chuckle from George. "It's going to be a great day, George," Charlie would proclaim, as if somehow understanding the optimism in the air. A great day. And so, every morning began with a routine that was now as much a part of George's day as anything else. But it wasn't just the mornings that had changed. Charlie had begun to play a role in George's life that he hadn't expected. It wasn't long before Charlie started helping George with small tasks. The parrot, ever the observer, had watched George for weeks as he tended to his plants, watered the garden, and completed little household chores. George didn't realize it at first, but Charlie had been paying close attention to the rhythm of his daily life. One afternoon, as George struggled to reach a jar on the top shelf in the kitchen, Charlie squawked from his perch. "Need help, George?" the bird asked in a voice that was eerily similar to George's own. George turned to the bird, blinking in surprise. "Well, yeah, actually," he said, laughing at the coincidence. "Can you help me grab that jar?" Charlie flapped his wings excitedly, then stretched out his beak, nudging the jar off the shelf and onto the countertop. "Here you go, George," Charlie called, his voice full of pride. George stared at him, astonished. "I can't believe you just did that. You're something else, Charlie." It wasn't the first time Charlie had surprised him. The bird seemed to understand more than George could have imagined, and with each passing day, George realized just how much Charlie had come to mean to him. Charlie wasn't just a companion anymore. He was a partner, someone who helped George in the ways that mattered most. In the evenings, George and Charlie would settle into their routine of reading together. George had picked up one of Clara's old books, a novel she had always loved, and would read aloud to Charlie as he sat on the armrest of the chair beside him. The bird would listen intently, sometimes chirping in response to certain passages or repeating words from the book. She walked into the room. George would read aloud, and Charlie would repeat the phrase. His voice soft but clear. She walked into the room. George smiled, knowing that Charlie didn't fully understand the meaning of the words, but the act itself was comforting. The bird's presence beside him, the simple act of reading aloud, filled the room with a sense of peace that George had longed for. It was a small moment of connection, between him and the bird, and between him and the memory of Clara. One evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned a soft shade of purple, George sat on the porch with Charlie perched on his shoulder. They sat in silence, watching the world go by. The air was cool, the chirping of crickets the only sound that filled the space. "You know, Charlie," George said quietly, "I never thought I'd find someone to talk to again. Not like this." Charlie tilted his head, looking up at George with those wise eyes. Then, as if to confirm the sentiment, he spoke in a gentle tone. "I'm here, George." George chuckled softly, his heart full. "Yeah, you sure are, buddy. And I'm grateful for it." The bond they shared was unspoken, but it was understood deeply by both of them. In the quiet of the evening, as the last rays of sunlight faded and the stars began to appear in the sky, George realized that Charlie had brought something back into his life that he hadn't even known he was missing: purpose. The simple routine of daily life, the companionship, the shared moments, it all meant something now. Charlie had not only helped George through the darkness, he had given him something to look forward to every day. And in turn, George had become a source of love and stability for Charlie, ensuring that the bird never had to face the same isolation that he had once endured. As they sat together on the porch, George smiled softly to himself. The future was uncertain, but with Charlie by his side, George knew he wasn't facing it alone anymore. In this chapter, the relationship between George and Charlie continues to deepen. The parrot is no longer just a pet, but an integral part of George's life, helping him with everyday tasks and offering companionship in ways that George never anticipated. The chapter emphasizes the simple yet powerful moments of connection that have become the foundation of their friendship. It also highlights George's emotional growth as he finds comfort and purpose in the presence of his feathered friend. Months passed, and life for George and Charlie found its rhythm. The days were filled with the comforting hum of routine: morning greetings, afternoon naps, and evenings spent reading together. The world outside had become more vibrant to George, filled with new possibilities. It was a far cry from the lonely, grief-stricken days that had consumed him after Clara's passing. Charlie had not only helped George cope with his solitude, but he had also given him a renewed sense of purpose. One afternoon, as the golden light filtered through the blinds, George sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee. Charlie, ever curious, hopped from his perch on the windowsill to join George, landing softly on the table. "Morning, George," Charlie chirped brightly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Good morning, Charlie," George replied, smiling. His eyes had softened over the months, the constant worry and sadness that once clouded his gaze now replaced by a quiet contentment. "How are you today?" Charlie tilted his head, his eyes sparkling with mischief. Good day, he squawked enthusiastically, flapping his wings. George chuckled at Charlie's antics, feeling his heart swell with affection. It was hard to believe how much things had changed. When Charlie had first arrived in his life, George had been so withdrawn, so wrapped in his grief, that he hadn't realized the bird would come to mean everything to him. Yet here they were, sharing a life together, each day offering new moments of joy, no matter how small. Later that afternoon, as George sat on the porch, watching the neighborhood go about its usual business, Jack came by for a visit. Jack had become not just a neighbor but a true friend, someone who had witnessed the transformation in George over the past few months. The bond between them was one of mutual respect and understanding. "How's he doing?" Jack asked, his eyes turning to Charlie, who was hopping around the porch railing, his feathers puffed out with excitement. "Better than ever," George replied, his voice filled with pride. "He's a little troublemaker now, always getting into things he shouldn't be." Charlie squawked loudly, as if in protest of George's words, before repeating, "Troublemaker. Trouble." Jack laughed, shaking his head. "Sounds like a handful." "He's been a handful for sure," George said with a smile. "But I wouldn't change a thing." As they talked, the conversation turned to more serious matters. Over the months, George had become more open with Jack, sharing stories of his past, his life with Clara, and the loneliness he had felt after her death. It was the first time he had really allowed someone into that part of his life, and it had felt like a weight lifting off his shoulders. "You've been through a lot, George," Jack said, his voice quiet but sincere. "But you've come a long way. Charlie's helped you more than you probably realize." George nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "I think you're right. Charlie's been a lifeline for me, Jack. I've learned more from him than I ever could have imagined." Jack smiled warmly. "I can see that. You're a different man than the one I first met." George chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I never thought a bird would change my life like this." But in truth, George knew that Charlie had given him something he hadn't even known he needed: hope. When he had felt lost and disconnected from the world, Charlie had been there, offering companionship without judgment. The bird's presence had filled a void in George's life, reminding him that there was always the possibility of a new beginning, no matter how dark things seemed. As they sat there together, Charlie hopped over to George's lap, settling down comfortably. George stroked the bird's feathers, a sense of peace washing over him. He had never imagined that he would find such a profound connection with an animal, but here he was, holding the very creature that had brought him back to life. "Thank you, Charlie," George whispered softly, his voice filled with emotion. "Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to start over." Charlie looked up at him, his eyes full of wisdom, as if understanding the weight of George's words. Then, with a soft chirp, he responded, "Start over, start over." For the first time in a long while, George felt truly at peace. His heart no longer ached with the weight of the past. The future, while still uncertain, felt full of potential. He had Charlie, and that was enough. Later that evening, after Jack had left, George sat by the window, gazing out at the quiet street. It was a peaceful moment, one that felt like the culmination of everything he had been through. His life was far from perfect, but it was his, filled with the love and companionship of a bird who had saved him when he didn't know he needed saving. "Good night, Charlie," George said quietly as the bird hopped to his perch. "Thank you for everything." Charlie looked at him for a moment, then settled down, ready for sleep. "Good night, George," he repeated softly, his voice full of warmth. As George closed his eyes, he couldn't help but feel that, in this moment, he had found everything he had been searching for: peace, love, and a true sense of belonging. With Charlie by his side, George knew that, no matter what the future held, he would never be alone again. In this chapter, George fully embraces the life he's built with Charlie, reflecting on how their bond has transformed him and brought him back to life after years of grief. The chapter emphasizes the theme of hope and the power of unexpected connections, as George's relationship with Charlie has not only healed him but has also helped him open up to others. The quiet moments of connection between George and the bird are a testament to the strength of their bond, symbolizing the idea that even the smallest acts of love can make a world of difference. The days continued to unfold in a gentle rhythm for George and Charlie, each day bringing with it new moments of quiet joy and contentment. The small routine they had established, coffee in the morning, Charlie's morning squawks, and evenings spent together, had become their shared life, and George had come to realize that he was no longer simply surviving. He was truly living again. But even in the comfort of his home, where the warmth of his connection with Charlie was ever present, George could feel the world continuing to move around him. There was something stirring deep inside him, a desire to push past the comfort of his routine, to rediscover the world outside the walls of his house. Perhaps it was the change in the seasons, or the way the sunlight streamed through the windows, but George knew it was time for something more. He had come to a place where he felt ready to step into the world again, to take what he had learned from his bond with Charlie and apply it to new experiences, new relationships, and a future he had nearly given up on. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch enjoying the sunshine, George looked over at Charlie, who was perched comfortably on the armrest beside him. The bird looked up at him, tilting his head, as if sensing the change in George's thoughts. "I've been thinking, Charlie," George said, his voice contemplative. "Maybe it's time to get out more. I've spent so much time here, and you've helped me heal in ways I never thought possible, but there's still a whole world out there waiting. It's time I stopped hiding from it." Charlie squawked in response, as if in agreement. Out there," he repeated, flapping his wings excitedly. George chuckled, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. "I guess you're right. Maybe I've been a bit of a hermit all this time, but I think I'm ready now. Ready for whatever comes next." The thought of venturing beyond the comfort of his home, of re-entering the world he had closed himself off from for so long, was both exciting and terrifying. But with Charlie by his side, George felt a sense of confidence he hadn't known he was capable of. The bird had been his anchor, his reminder that there was more to life than sorrow and loss. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, George made a decision. He would start small, maybe take a walk around the neighborhood, or visit the local park. It wasn't a huge step, but it was a step forward. He didn't need to rush. He just needed to move, to keep moving forward. Later that week, George did exactly that. He put on his shoes, grabbed Charlie's small carrier, and headed out the door. Charlie had become so accustomed to his presence that it felt only natural to take him along. As George walked through the familiar streets, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. The world was still there, still turning, still full of life, and he was part of it again, even if he was just one small step into the world. When they reached the park, George found a bench near a small pond, where the sound of birds chirping filled the air. Charlie chirped back, as if excited by the unfamiliar surroundings. "Look at that, Charlie," George said, motioning to the ducks gliding gracefully across the water. "Life's still beautiful, even if we don't always see it right away." Charlie tilted his head and repeated, "Beautiful, beautiful." The simplicity of the moment, the calmness of the park, the quiet sound of nature, and Charlie's contented chirps was everything George had been searching for. He realized that life didn't have to be complicated. It didn't have to be filled with grand gestures or monumental achievements. Sometimes it was enough to just exist, to take in the beauty of the world around him, and to know that he wasn't alone in it. As they sat there, watching the sunset together, George felt a profound sense of peace. This was what he had been missing, a sense of belonging, of connection, not just with Charlie, but with the world. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like an outsider. He was part of something bigger, part of a world that was still full of possibilities. When they returned home later that evening, George was filled with a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had taken a step forward, and while it might have been small, it was meaningful. Charlie had been by his side every step of the way, as he always had been, and George knew that with the bird's presence in his life, there was nothing he couldn't face. "Thanks, buddy," George whispered as they settled back into the comfort of their home. "You've shown me that no matter what happens, I'm never alone." Charlie gave a soft chirp in response, as if acknowledging this sentiment. "Never alone," he echoed gently. And in that moment, George realized that no matter where life took him, he would always have Charlie, the bird who had shown him the way back to hope, to connection, and to a future full of possibilities. Together, they would face whatever came next, knowing that the strength of their bond would carry them through. In this chapter, George takes a significant step toward re-engaging with the world around him, aided by his deep bond with Charlie. The chapter highlights themes of healing, renewal, and the transformative power of love and companionship. George's willingness to embrace new experiences, while small at first, marks a turning point in his journey of self-discovery and growth. Charlie's presence continues to be a source of comfort and motivation, reminding George that he is never truly alone. Here's the translation. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and if you've watched until here, comment, "I watched until here," and share your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the final screen. It's very emotional.